Welcome back to my channel. So there is obviously an elephant in the room that we need to address and talk about. And I have had conversations with a few people over this last few days actually, and I see a lot of the general consensus is that people do not understand what happened at the Capitol and why it has to do with race. And so I want to address that. I want to talk about that today. And it's going to be a hard conversation, but you know me, I'm up for the challenge. And to be quite fair, I think it needs to be had. I think for so long we've been in this bubble, and so many people think that, you know, these issues kind of just go away, or that they're more quiet, or they're more silent, or they're just not talked about as much. And then things like this happen and it brings it to a bubble where we need to address the conversation. And really, which is why I created this YouTube, so that the conversation never goes away and that we can have the conversation with each other and, you know, understand things like this when they arise. And what in the world does it have to do with race? So I really want to say thank you so much for liking and subscribing. If you haven't subscribed yet, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and you'll be alerted anytime that there's new videos out. Let's talk about what it has to do with race. What happened at the Capitol with the Trump rally, Trump supporters? How does that tie to what's happening? The short answer, you know you're about to get the long one, but the short answer is inconsistencies. There aren't consistencies when it comes to our president in this scenario and how he responds to both protesters on the levels when things started to get violent. His response just isn't consistent. And one can't help but wonder, or one can't help but realize and understand that, yes, there are biases here. When the Black Lives Matter protesters, and there were instances of violence happening, there were times where these Confederate statues were being vandalized and stuff like that, President Trump came out with a video. So in the video, President Trump, he calls them domestic terrorists, he calls them criminals. He goes on to say all these things after riots are taking place with Black Lives Matter protests. Then, when we see after what happened on Wednesday, President Trump says that he loves them, that they're special. And we could see the tone, the difference as to when he was speaking about one group and when he was speaking about the other group. And if we're being honest, there's obviously a very, very stark difference between his tone with one group of people when riots took place and his tone with another group of people when riots took place. And also the Capitol Police and the police in the DC area, when there were protests happening, Black Lives Matter protests happening in DC, the police departments were proactive. They took an initiative to be prepared for it. And as you can see, that same initiative wasn't happening on Wednesday. They were reactive, right? And there's something that needs to be said about that. They are proactive when they have this idea that they're violent protesters, right? And then with another group of people, they are reactive. And we can't say there's never been violence here, because obviously we've seen instances where violence has taken place, and after Trump rallies, or dealing with people who, you know, some people who are Trump supporters. And so it kind of brings this idea as that we feel threatened in a sense, or we're proactive with this type of people, but we don't feel like these type of people would be violent. And that's really boils down to an implicit bias in both scenarios. And even with the lady that was shot at the Capitol, which we see how differences are portrayed in the media too. You know, you have this lady that was killed at the Capitol and in the middle of committing a crime. And we hear about her accolades. We hear about how long she was in the military for, and we hear about how she has a husband and kids. We humanize her, right? We make her human. That way we could feel some sort of empathy kind of pull on our hearts for her, right? We feel this pull for her. Yet we have someone like Brianna Taylor who has a boyfriend in previous years that was involved in drugs, and we excuse her death because She should have never been, even though they weren't together, even though they hadn't been together in years, she should have never been with him in the first place. And that way we've excused her death. We have all these things that come out about Brianna Taylor. You know, people are like, well, she was an EMT. Well, she wasn't an EMT for 7 months or however many years. Well, she was this. Well, she wasn't that. And we excuse her, right? We dehumanize her so that way we don't feel any pull or empathy towards her. And we see this in so many different scenarios, right? Unfortunately, when it comes to the difference in race in people. And we have this great divide because in our minds, we build this bias up that black people are criminals and white people are not. And our first unconscious, when we first look at those things, we see Brianna Taylor is not in the process of committing a crime when she's killed. We see that she has changed her life. She's bettered her life. She is no longer with that same person, right? We see these things. We see this person in the middle of committing a federal offense in the Capitol, and the only separation between her and the vice president is that Secret Service agent and whatever window she was trying to climb through. And listen, all loss of life is bad, it's horrible, but we can tend to gain empathy of someone when we don't feel for them. There's something that pulls, like I said, even how the media portrays black people. You know, we hear about this woman and her accolades, but even though she was killed in the middle of committing a federal offense. And then we give an excuse to someone like Brianna Taylor and why she died. And there's these things, whether we want to say, you know, why is everything about race? Why does everything need to be made about race? It's because it always has been. Race has always been in the forefront. And I would rather grab it by the horns and tame it and get rid of it than to act like this isn't a part of the conversation. Because if we don't fix this, all we're going to do is pass this down to our kids. Martin Luther King Day is coming up next week. And I constantly think of the great doctor, I like to call him, and the things that he says, and his approval rating when he was alive, and how many people didn't like him. And it's always interesting, you know, we think of Dr. Martin Luther King as, you know, this obvious civil rights leader, you know, but people hated him while he was here because he brought up a conversation that was hard to talk about. He fought for civil rights and made people feel uncomfortable. And we have to get to a place of uncomfortability, compassion, empathy, in order to understand why people are hurting. And it's easy for us to put the wall up, right? And act like these things don't happen. That, you know, it's just easier to let it go. You know, I can't tell you guys how many times I've had that Morgan Freeman quote in my inbox where Morgan Freeman said a long time ago, the way to get rid of race is to just not talk about it. And that's not it. That's not how you get rid of it. And you know what's interesting is there's nothing in our DNA. This is what's crazy. And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but there's nothing in our DNA that determines our race. There's nothing there that determines our race. Nothing in our DNA. Which tells us that race, that's a man-made thing. That's a man-made thing. And so we now have to handle that. And we have to address it and look at it head first. And be honest with ourselves. And be anti-racist. Like, if you haven't seen one of my previous videos, I did a whole video on the difference between not racist and anti-racist. And being anti-racist is actively dismantling systems of oppression. Helping people rid of implicit biases and ideologies that keep us in this position. And it's easy for us to sit back and act like these things aren't affecting people. How do we as people, and even some of us that are watching this as Christians, say that we can't find it in us to show empathy? We're annoyed by the talks of race, and we want it to go away, and we want it to just stop, but it's not gonna stop. It's just gonna be passed down. Just like it was with Dr. Martin Luther King, and now. And just like it will be if we don't grab this bull by the horns. It's not going to go away. There will be another George Floyd. There will be another Brianna Taylor. There will be another Tamir Rice. There will be another protest. There will be riots. There will be those things. Unless we address the issues. Unless we address the biases. Unless we look inside of ourselves and rid those things. It's not going to go away. And we have to be honest with ourselves and look in the mirror and ask ourselves, is there anything that we can change? Not get offended, not get upset. Is there anything that we can change? Is there anything that maybe we didn't get right? Putting aside that pride, not being like we have to be right all the time, but understanding it. Because obviously we all have biases. Everybody has them, especially when it comes to race. We all do. Even black people have implicit biases about black people. No one is exempt from this conversation, and we all need to be a part of it to change it. It takes all of us. It takes all of us. Diversity is intentional. We have to surround ourselves with people that we don't look like, that are diverse, that are different than us. So that way we can gain some understanding about their life and maybe things that we've never had to walk through because of who we are. And those things are important. They're important. And so I'm glad we got to sit down and have this tough conversation. And I know we'll continue to have tough conversations, but I know we can get through it. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that our kids, my kids, won't have to fight as hard. I'm hopeful that we'll live in a world one day that's more peaceful. And I'm hopeful that one day, racism would be just such an afterthought, so far off in our minds, that it sticks out like a sore thumb. But I want to thank you guys for being here, for liking and subscribing, and being a part of this journey with me. I hope you have a blessed rest of your day. See you guys later. Bye.